You're standing on a sun-scorched plain somewhere in the Holy Land. The year is 1187. The heat is unbearable, dust clings to your skin, and the ground beneath you begins to quake. A low, rhythmic thunder rolling closer and closer. In the distance, you see them. Thousands of hooves hammer the desert earth in unison, each beat sounding like the drumroll of war. Quick pause. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments so we can see how many corners of the world are experiencing this moment together. This is no ordinary medieval clash. What you are about to witness is a masterclass in calculated destruction, military tactics so precise, so devastating, that they would rewrite the very playbook of war for centuries to come. The Crusaders weren't just wild-eyed fanatics with swords raised to heaven. No, they were the engineers of the most terrifyingly efficient killing machine Europe had ever unleashed. A war machine so refined that it sliced through the Middle East like a well-honed blade through silk, leaving Islamic armies scrambling to survive a style of warfare they had never faced before. And here's where most people get it wrong. These weren't reckless holy warriors blindly charging into battle, hoping for divine favor to save them. Every single maneuver, every formation, every siege operation was calculated with almost scientific precision. The Crusaders had taken warfare, that chaotic, brutal business, and turned it into a science. And their enemies paid the price in blood. Over the next few minutes, we're going to pull apart exactly how these warriors dominated battlefields for nearly 3 centuries. You'll discover the tactical innovations that earned them terrifying nicknames in Islamic chronicles. Iron Men, Men of Steel. We'll break down the techniques that allowed relatively small European armies to carve out kingdoms thousands of miles from home and hold them against overwhelming numbers. At the very core of Crusader military power was one concept, one terrifying weapon, that would come to define medieval warfare: the heavy cavalry charge. But forget the chaotic Hollywood-style stampedes you've seen on screen. This was something far more calculated, far more lethal. Picture this: you're an Islamic infantryman standing in formation outside the walls of Antioch. The desert air is still, the sun rising behind the horizon. Then you see it. A wall of moving steel, glinting in the light, advancing toward you in perfect formation. 200 knights, each fully armored, weighing over 300 pounds with gear, mounted on war horses bred for one purpose: to destroy. They advance at nearly 20 miles per hour, knee to knee, lances lowered in unison like the spears of a single mechanical monster. The physics alone are enough to chill your blood. Mass times acceleration equals force. And here you have roughly 1,500 pounds of man, steel, and horseflesh behind every single knight, moving with the momentum of a modern car. When that force narrows to the point of a 12-foot lance, it's no longer just a charge. It's a battering ram with the power to shatter shield walls as if they were parchment. But here's the thing. The genius of this weapon wasn't just in the raw force. It was in the precision. These men weren't individual warriors acting on instinct. They were synchronized components of a single war machine. Byzantine historian Anna Komnene once remarked that a Frankish knight on horseback could make a hole through the walls of Babylon. She wasn't exaggerating. She was describing the way these charges smashed through infantry lines that had dominated Middle Eastern warfare for centuries. And the psychological effect? Equally catastrophic. Chroniclers tell us that seasoned soldiers, men who had faced battle before, froze at the sight of that wall of steel thundering toward them. The earth-shaking hooves, the blinding glint of armor, the flawless discipline of the formation. It shattered morale before the first lance ever struck. Many battles were decided before they even began. Armies broke not because they were defeated, but because they were terrified into collapse. The Templars, in particular, elevated this into an art form. Their charges were legendary, not just for their brutality, but for their perfect execution. They developed signals, timing sequences, and specialized formations that turned the heavy cavalry charge from a blunt force attack into a surgical strike. Armies 10 times their size were splintered, scattered, and annihilated by a single, well-timed assault. And here's the key: this devastating cavalry charge was only one piece of a much larger, highly organized tactical system. The Crusaders had cracked something that most medieval armies struggled with: the ability to coordinate multiple arms of war, cavalry, infantry, archers, engineers, and make them function like one machine of death. Combined arms warfare, the art of taking many separate instruments of war and fusing them into a single, devastating weapon system. This was the real genius of the Crusaders. A typical Crusader host was no disorganized mob. At its heart stood the heavy cavalry, the mailed knights, the shock troops, the living sledgehammers designed to smash through enemy lines. Behind them, an even greater force: disciplined infantry armed with spears, shields, and deadly crossbows. And here's the key: these weren't merely backup troops. They weren't there just to watch the knights claim glory. They were essential pieces of a carefully crafted tactical puzzle. Here's how the machine worked. First, the infantry would advance in tight formation, shields raised to form a wall. Behind them, the crossbowmen unleashed volleys of bolts, ripping into enemy ranks, cutting down officers, and throwing formations into disarray. Then came the critical moment. When enemy lines started to buckle, when cohesion faltered, the infantry would part like a curtain, and through the opening would roar the heavy cavalry, thundering forward to deliver the killing blow. This wasn't just brute strength. This was choreography on the battlefield. A level of coordination that required relentless training, discipline, and a language of battlefield signals that most armies of the era simply didn't possess. The Crusaders could adapt on the fly. They could shift formations mid-battle, respond to sudden ambushes, even reorganize after taking heavy casualties, and still maintain enough cohesion to launch a decisive strike. And then there was the crossbow, one of the most feared weapons of the age. Unlike the composite bows favored by Islamic armies, which required years of training to master, a crossbow could be taught to a recruit in weeks. Its bolts could punch through mail armor that ordinary arrows simply bounced off. During sieges, crossbowmen stationed on walls or behind wooden mantlets could deliver precision, armor-piercing fire that made attacking a fortified position a nightmare. Suddenly, even an inexperienced soldier could kill a fully armored knight from range. This changed everything. It equalized power in a way that reshaped medieval warfare. But perhaps the most terrifying side of Crusader warfare was not the charge, not the crossbow, but their systematic approach to siegecraft. They didn't simply surround a city and wait for hunger to do the job. They turned siege warfare into a science of annihilation. Outside your city walls, you would see it begin. Giant siege engines taking shape, timber by timber. Massive trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones with earth-shaking force. Mangonels designed to rain destruction from such a distance that defending archers were nearly useless. And these weren't just weapons. They were psychological terror made manifest. The very sight of a trebuchet being built was a message. Surrender now or face what's coming. Chroniclers described defenders abandoning the walls just from the sight of these machines taking form. The Crusaders understood this effect and leaned into it. The hammering of construction, the slow, visible raising of the frames, the careful balancing of counterweights. Every step was meant to break morale. Day by day, defenders were forced to watch their own destruction being built right in front of them. And when the stones began to fly, the psychological pressure became unbearable. But the Crusaders didn't stop there. They weaponized fear itself. Their siege engines hurled not only stone, but horror, diseased carcasses, rotting human remains, containers of flaming pitch. The goal wasn't just to breach walls. It was to spread terror, to choke defenders with smoke and stench, to make resistance feel not just futile but suicidal. The fall of Nicaea in 1097 is a chilling example. The defenders surrendered rather than face the continued bombardment and the plague of disease and death filling their streets. And while the defenders' eyes were fixed on the sky and the siege towers, something more insidious was happening beneath their feet. Crusader engineers were digging. Mining operations, tunnels carved under key points of the walls, were designed to bring down fortifications in a single catastrophic collapse. Timber supports held the tunnels in place until the moment was right. Then they were set ablaze. As the supports burned away, entire sections of wall crumbled, opening wide gaps for the cavalry to charge through. It was a nightmare combination of engineering, patience, and precision, a level of methodical destruction that few cities could withstand for long. The Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097 was not just another clash in the First Crusade. It was a showcase of one of the Crusaders' most dangerous traits, their ability to adapt under crushing pressure. Picture the scene. Bohemon's army, marching under the blazing Anatolian sun, suddenly finds itself surrounded at dawn. Kilij Arslan's Turkish forces descend like a storm, unleashing their signature weapon, mounted archery. This was a nightmare scenario. The Turks' strategy was tried, tested, and devastatingly effective. Their horse archers galloped in, loosing wave after wave of arrows before wheeling away out of reach. They would repeat the cycle, each pass whittling away at enemy ranks, killing the horses, bleeding the army dry one arrow at a time. Against most foes, this tactic was a death sentence. But Bohemon's response would prove why Crusader armies were so dangerous. Instead of launching hopeless cavalry charges after an enemy who refused to stand still, he made a radical decision. He ordered his knights to dismount. On foot, the Crusaders formed tight defensive rings, locking shields and using their heavy armor as a wall of iron. Inside these circles, the vulnerable foot soldiers, the camp followers, even the wounded found protection. The marshy terrain worked in their favor. It slowed the Turkish cavalry and neutralized their ability to charge home. What could have been a slaughter turned into a tense stalemate. And that stalemate bought time. Precious hours for Godfrey of Bouillon to arrive with reinforcements. When Godfrey's banners appeared on the horizon, everything changed. Now the Turks were caught between two Crusader forces. Their mobility advantage evaporated. The hunters became the hunted. From two directions came armored knights, advancing like walls of steel. What had been a cautious harassment campaign turned into a desperate struggle for survival, and the Turkish force was annihilated so completely that the Crusaders were able to cross Anatolia virtually unopposed. This was more than just a victory. It was proof that Crusader armies could switch tactics mid-battle, going from offense to defense, from mounted shock troops to infantry phalanx, from static siege warfare to open field pursuit, all while maintaining discipline and command structure. Their enemies quickly learned that nothing about Crusader tactics was predictable, and that unpredictability extended beyond the battlefield. The Crusaders' coastal strategy that followed demonstrated their long-term strategic vision. They didn't try to conquer every inch of the Holy Land. Instead, they methodically seized one port after another: Haifa in 1100, Arsuf in 1101, Tortosa in 1102, Acre in 1104, Tripoli in 1109, and finally, the jewel of the coast, Tyre in 1124. This wasn't random conquest. It was a masterstroke of logistics and psychology. By holding the ports, the Crusaders kept direct communication and supply lines open with Europe. Fresh troops, provisions, and money could flow in by sea. Their enemies, cut off from maritime support, had to rely solely on slow, vulnerable overland routes that the Crusaders raided constantly. And there was a psychological effect as well. Each port that fell sent a chilling message. Resistance was futile. The Crusaders were not simply occupying the Holy Land. They were dismantling the infrastructure that made resistance possible. But perhaps their most brilliant and most unnerving capability was their use of deception. Crusader commanders mastered the art of the feigned retreat, a maneuver as dangerous as it was brilliant. Chroniclers tell of battles where a small force of knights would deliberately break formation and flee in apparent panic. Enemy cavalry, thinking victory was at hand, would pursue them, abandoning discipline, stretching out their lines. And then, when the moment was perfect, hidden Crusader reserves would emerge. The fleeing knights would wheel around, and the pursuers would find themselves crushed in a deadly pincer. This wasn't improvisation. It was choreography, carefully rehearsed and executed with perfect timing. The psychological effect was shattering. Commanders who saw their forces destroyed in such traps never forgot the lesson. Of course, Crusader brilliance was not untouchable. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 shattered that illusion. Saladin's brilliant strategy, using the brutal heat, cutting off water, and forcing the Crusaders into exhaustion, broke even one of the most disciplined armies of the medieval age. But here's the key. Hattin didn't just mark their downfall. It proved how formidable the Crusaders had become, powerful enough that their enemies had to match them in strategy, not just numbers. Across 2 centuries, the Crusaders transformed the art of war. They fused devastating cavalry charges with disciplined infantry formations, mastered psychological warfare, revolutionized siege tactics, and even turned deception into a weapon as sharp as any sword. These weren't simply fanatical warriors marching for God's glory. They were innovators, engineers of destruction, men who proved that victory isn't about the biggest army, but the one that can think faster, adapt smarter, and strike with precision. And their legacy didn't vanish with the last Crusader fortress. Their methods reshaped warfare for generations to come. Now I want to know what you think. Do you see the Crusaders as brilliant tacticians or dangerous fanatics who changed war forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'd love to see where you stand. Before you go, hit like, share this with a friend who loves history, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Together, we'll keep unearthing the battles, betrayals, and brilliance that shaped the medieval world. Stay curious. History is full of surprises.